Hello and welcome to this episode of Philosophy for All. Today we're privileged to be joined by Dr. Liz Jackson to talk about the nature of faith, especially in a philosophical perspective. Dr. Liz Jackson is an associate professor of philosophy at St. Louis University and researches mostly on epistemology as well as the philosophy of religion with specific references to Pascal's wager and faith. As a Christian YouTuber and, in the past this channel used to be called Apologetics for All before it became Philosophy for All. Faith is often a very important aspect of Christian philosophy. And of course, when we're thinking about the goals of apologetics, how we should be approaching it. So we're really privileged to have Dr. Jackson onto the channel. Dr. Jackson, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation. And I think there's a lot of really great topics we're going to get into. So yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
Indeed. I mean, I'm just really looking forward to talk about Pascal's wager and faith with you because I've come across these things in the past, but I'm not very sure about the nuances of these ideas, which I hopefully we will develop in this video. So just get started. What got you interested in researching about faith and Pascal's wager? Because in apologetics and natural theology, people like talking about kalam cosmological arguments or natural theology or fine-tuning arguments. What brings you to this field?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I like the kind of contrast you bring up there with sort of, you could contrast maybe like first order questions. So it's like, does God exist? Kind of assessing the state of our evidence. So kalam is obviously an argument that God exists. The problem of evil would obviously be an argument God doesn't exist, right? And then I'm kind of more thinking about these like second order questions or higher order questions, like, what should we do given the state of our evidence? What should we believe? What should we commit to? What, those sorts of things. So I guess to more directly answer your question, I did actually kind of come at these two topics separately in a way. A lot of people in my undergrad were very interested in decision theory, which kind of got me more interested in decision theory. But I had always been really interested in philosophy of religion, growing up in a religious household and being religious myself. And so Pascal's wager was a really natural sort of intersection between the two. People interested in philosophy of religion who are in environments where people are all talking about decision theory, like Pascal's wager seems like a natural thing that would come up. So I kind of came to that in undergrad. But then I also do remember in undergrad explicitly wondering, how could faith be rational if it's like opposed to evidence or going beyond the evidence? Like what even is faith? How should we understand it? And so really, I think I was interested in both of these initially, really in undergrad. And like, again, these are kind of second order questions. And so then I think as I started getting into more of both of these topics, I realized, look, what actually really unites both of these topics is that they're both about when is a religious commitment rational? Where commitment's understood broadly, that could be practicing a religion, converting to a religion, believing a religion. It could be kind of all of those things. And so really, I think questions about looking at the evidence is really great. I'm interested in that. But if we are like, look, the evidence is really complicated, there's kind of arguments on both sides, where do we go from there? That's kind of where my research comes in. And I think if we do think there's arguments for theism and arguments for atheism that are both really interesting, how could we break that tie? Are they just tied and we just should be agnostic, or is there more we can say there? I think there's more we can say there. So anyway, that's kind of what got me really interested in both these questions.
That's quite fascinating, and I quite like how you've framed this discussion. You talked about getting into it from, I suppose, a faith background and then getting into the more philosophical side of things. And I suspect that a lot of people going into this video have come from a faith background. They have their Christian idea of faith. Maybe their pastors told them about what faith is. So when we're approaching this from perhaps a more philosophical perspective, are we dealing with two different concepts here? How should we kind of orient our thinking when it comes to this term?
Yeah, faith is a huge concept, right? And so I think this is a really good question because I think it can give me a chance to clarify sort of what is faith, which is really the question we should start off with anyway. And I don't know if there's just one standard way that term is used. I actually think there probably isn't one standard way the term is always used. And I will say there are sort of two ways the term is used that I think are a little bit wrong in certain ways. The first, and understandably, I think, but some people, when they hear the word faith, they just think, oh, it's just a religious belief. Faith is just a religious belief. I think that's a common term. You probably, like, people in church might use the term in that way. If you hadn't thought about it for a while, like if you kind of just like, oh, I have faith, or I'm a person of faith. Like a lot of times we just mean I have religious beliefs. You know what I mean? So, but I do think that's one. And then the other one that maybe is going to be more controversial is there's this anti-religious view of faith where they kind of use the word faith to mean believing something that's obviously false, or like believing against your evidence or something. And so I think both of these definitions are not quite right. So the first definition, I think, doesn't account for non-religious faith, right? I think we can have faith in our friends, faith in our families. We can have faith in ideals, like I have faith in a political party, or faith in the Constitution, or faith in recycling, and so I think that's the problem with the first definition, is that it's too specific. Even if religious faith is an important strand of faith, faith is broader than that. Okay, so that's like why I think maybe the first definition, I'm not saying is we should just totally throw out as an unimportant kind of faith, but I don't think it captures the full range of types of faith. The second definition, which is like faith is just believing something obviously false, I think that the problem is, well, I think of faith as like belief in this regard. So we have beliefs. Some of our beliefs are rational and some of them are irrational, right? So I'm like, my belief it's sunny outside is rational. I just look outside and I see the sun, right? But maybe if I believe like my kid's going to play in the NBA someday because I just think my kid's the best, like that's not rational. You know what I mean? So beliefs can be rational, beliefs can be irrational. And my view is that that's how faith is as well. We can have faith that's rational, faith that's in a well-placed object that we have good evidence for, and we can have faith that's irrational. Sometimes we believe against the evidence or have faith against the evidence. And we'll get into this more later, but really my view is that rational faith can go beyond the evidence, but it cannot go against the evidence. Okay, so yeah, I think faith is like belief in that it can be rational, can be irrational, and even if you reject that, I don't think we should just define faith as irrational, because then I'm just going to use a different word, right? I'm just going to say, well, what about trust, or what about commitment, and so I don't think, even if you're thinking faith is always irrational, I think the best way to do that is to give an argument for that rather than just define faith as always irrational. So that said, I mean, your broader question was more about defining faith. And I do think, yeah, both these definitions aren't quite right. I think they're actually both too narrow, because the first doesn't give us non-religious faith. The second doesn't give us rational faith. I think those are all types of faith. And I think the general thing I want to say is I do think there are different kinds of faith. So I don't think faith is just this singular thing. And so I think you could have religious or non-religious faith. You could have important faith or mundane faith. Maybe you have faith that like your picnic won't get rained out tomorrow. That might be a little more mundane, whereas a lot of people like their faith in their spouse or their religious faith. That's going to be maybe more important faith. There's also like faith that versus faith in, another distinction people talk about. So anyway, it's not saying there's not these sub-concepts or distinctions between kinds of faith, but I do think faith is this kind of broad category.
And you've talked about this broad category, and I suppose there's a lot of different distinctions that we can now kind of go into. One of those distinctions, I suppose, is the distinction between attitude-focused faith and action-focused faith. And I suppose in some ways people could think about this maybe in light of if someone's come from a Christian background, a book of James, where it's like faith without works is dead. What does that mean? I was wondering whether that's a good way to go into this distinction, whether it's not a good way to go into this distinction. And I suppose either way, what is this distinction between these two forms of faith?
No, for sure. I mean, my short answer is yes. Like, I think the book of James is actually a really nice way of making this distinction, but maybe I'll come back to that in a second. So attitude-focused faith is faith that's something that's in your head. It's like a mental state. So things that are in our head are like beliefs, desires, emotions, intentions. These are mental states that are in our heads, okay? So it would be faith similar to those, right? Action-focused faith, in contrast, is faith as an action or as a decision. So it's something you do. When people talk about taking a leap of faith, I think a lot of times that's what they're talking about here. And let me just give two quick examples to kind of illustrate the difference here, because I do think this is an important difference. Of course, these things can go together, but I think they can also come apart. So you could have someone who really does genuinely believe their spouse is not cheating on them. They say, I don't have evidence my spouse is cheating. My spouse has always been a good and faithful person. But for some reason, maybe they were cheated on in the past, give me your psychological story, whatever it is. They cannot shake this jealous feeling they have. And so they're just constantly checking their spouse's emails behind their back, asking their coworkers what they're doing. Like, they have their location on their phone and they're tracing them all the time, right? And so they're paranoid, and their actions aren't lining up to their attitudes, right? They really do believe their spouse isn't cheating, but they're not acting on that belief. They're acting on their jealousy or their paranoia instead. So that's, I think, an example of attitude-focused faith. You have the belief, right? But you don't have the action. Then another really interesting case is you can have the action, but maybe not have the relevant attitude. So this is an example that I think is really interesting from Daniel Speake. Daniel Speake has this paper, I think it's called Salvation Without Belief, but he has an example in that of Thomas. So Thomas was brought up in a situation where he just was taught the police are untrustworthy, they're not good people, you can't trust the police. So he doesn't believe the police are trustworthy, he doesn't have positive feelings towards the police, but he actually ends up in some really bad situation. He's trapped somewhere, and the only way he can get out of that situation is if he jumps and trusts that a police officer will catch him. And he's like, look, I don't trust the police, I don't have positive feelings towards them, I don't believe they're trustworthy, but literally that's my only hope right now. That's the only thing I can do to get out of this bad situation. Otherwise I might like just die up here or something. So I'm going to go ahead and jump. And so that's a really interesting case to me, because it's like he doesn't have the relevant attitude that we would think someone would have if they had attitude faith, but there's a sense in which he demonstrates faith in the police officer by taking that leap of faith, jumping and like letting the police officer catch him. So when, back to the James thing just quickly, I do think part of what James is saying is if you're like the jealous spouse with respect to God, that's not going to cut it. That's not the kind of faith that's relevant for Christianity. You can't just say you believe, or maybe really you do believe in God, but not act on that belief. You need the action-focused faith as well. So I do think that's the book of James is really relevant for this distinction, but I also think there's senses in which it's more broadly relevant as well.
I suppose developing on that with when we were introducing faith, you talked about someone having rational faith beyond the evidence, but not faith in some sense against the evidence. In the case of the guy jumping down to the police officer, could it be a circumstance where that's almost quite similar to a faith against the evidence, assuming that evidence he had in front of him, it might be rightly or wrongly, but was still some evidence to not trust the police officer? How would I suppose those two interact with each other?
Great question. Yes. So I think this helps me like further clarify my view now that we have this distinction on the table. So when you're talking about faith as an attitude or a mental state, there's going to be more stringent evidential requirements. Like it's going to be a little bit more closely tied to the evidence. So even if we'll get into in a second, like doesn't always require belief, or we'll talk about that in a second. Even if there's sometimes it can come apart from the belief, you wouldn't want to have faith as an attitude in something that you think was extraordinarily unlikely or impossible. And so when I say it's going to be, I think it could still go beyond the evidence, but it's definitely not going to go against the evidence. Faith as an action, to say it's fully going against the evidence might not be right, but it can come apart from the evidence a lot more. And that's really just because the rationality of our mental states is just a different kind of rationality than the rationality of our actions. With our actions, it's totally permissible to take risks, even if those risks come apart from the evidence, because that's just sort of the feature of practical rationality, which is rationality of action. So you could think about a case. Let me think of a nice example of this, where you make an investment in a really risky stock, right? And you might think, look, especially when you're young, this is what like our financial advisor tells us, like it's better to make some risky investments, especially if you spread them out, because that's going to like help you do better in the long run. And of course, with each individual stock, you might think like there's a very low probability it's actually going to play out and give you that really big return. But it could still be rational to invest in a really risky stock because you do have that high chance of return. So that would be like one example of you're kind of acting against the evidence in a way, but it's rational because the payoff is so large. This is kind of like, we'll get into this later too, but like a version of what's going on in the Pascal's wager case as well. But yeah, I do think, again, it depends on how we want to characterize against the evidence, because you wouldn't want to invest in it if the chances of it growing were zero or just like astronomically low. It needs to have some kind of live possibility there, but it's going to be a much lower evidential standard than I think actually having faith in a mental state sense the stock is going to be successful. So does that answer your question? So yeah. I actually think like people saying like faith faith's rationality when it comes to faith as an action is actually really easy to account for. And it's a little harder actually when it comes to faith as a mental state, because I think that's going to be more closely tied to our evidence. That's sort of to sum it up.
And talking about the evidence, I suppose we've also been flirting with the idea of belief in and the proposition side of things. And one of the questions which comes up in the literature is whether it's necessarily the case that if one has faith in a proposition, that they must also believe in it. What are some of the perspectives and approaches that people have debated about this?
Yeah, great. So I think there's really 3 views here. So first I'll say the views and then maybe like say a little bit more about like my take on it. So the first view is what you might call doxastic views of faith. I know like philosophers love to use like big words for simple concepts. Doxastic basically just means belief or belief-like or something, right? So on doxastic views of faith, faith always involves a belief. So if you have faith that a proposition is true, you have to believe that proposition is true. Those things just always go together. And then there's what you might call like a weakly doxastic view of faith. And that's the view that faith doesn't have to always involve a belief, but it does involve some kind of cognitive attitude. So it has like, you have to have sufficient confidence or think the thing is sufficiently probable, or maybe you have to assume it's true, something like that. So even if it's not belief, it still has some kind of cognitive attitude, where cognitive attitude is something like an evidence responsive attitude or something like that. And then there's what the third view is kind of the weakest. It's called non-doxastic views. So no belief or belief-like attitude is required at all. Or sometimes these are called pragmatist views of faith. And basically it's just like, you don't need confidence, you don't need belief. Really, I think a lot of these views say you need some kind of practical commitment. So more action focused is really what these views are going to be. So the first 2 views are more focused on faith as a mental state, but disagree on whether belief is required or something that's belief-like but weaker than belief would be enough for faith. And then the last view just says you don't need belief or anything belief-like. It's just really faith is a matter of action. Okay, so here's like my sort of take on this. I think like, look, if we already have this distinction between action-focused faith and attitude-focused faith, and we think those are just like 2 reasonable kinds of faith, then we can just say, actually, the pragmatist view of faith, that's just kind of like in a way describing action-focused faith, which is a reasonable kind of faith and something that's worth thinking about and worth considering. But I don't know if there's like some ultimate question of like, what is faith, period? There's just 2 kinds. I do think the more interesting debate is, does attitude-focused faith require belief, or does it just require something belief-like confidence or judging it to be more probable than not or something like that, and not a full-blown flat-out belief? So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I haven't really taken a stance on this in most of my work. I'm sympathetic to the idea that states weaker than flat-out belief could play faith's cognitive role, but I don't think anything I've argued in print like requires that necessarily. And I will say there's like, just to give you a flavor of some of the debate here, people that think faith requires belief say, look, if you can have faith without belief, then it seems like you're just kind of playing pretend when you like do things like go to church or continue to engage in your marriage. Like if you really don't believe God exists, or you really don't believe your spouse is a good person or has been faithful to you, like what are you doing? So Laura Ekstrom has a really interesting paper called Religion on the Cheap, and she thinks it's just kind of like a cheap version of religion that's not true faith. And other people have argued this is what they call it, that's fictionalism, where you can sort of treat something as a useful but false false thing. And so they say it's not real faith, it's kind of like just pretending. So that's like the faith requires belief view. But the other people say, well, look, like it seems like part of what we want faith to do is help us get through periods of struggles and doubts. And sometimes we go through doubts so intense that they take our belief away. Mother Teresa, some people think, went through something like this, where she was really questioning, does God love her? Does God even exist? When you read her journals, she went through like quite a bit of agonizing and doubting and unclarity about God and God's existence. And even if you think that's not the perfect interpretation of Mother Teresa's journals, you could imagine a case similar, right? But Mother Teresa continued in her commitment, continued to serve the poor, continued in her religious practices, continued to, I think, have some reasonable amount of confidence God existed, but it just wasn't enough for belief. And so like people want to say Mother Teresa doesn't have faith, that seems like a really strong claim. It seems like Mother Teresa did have faith and demonstrated it in lots of ways, even if she didn't have that full-blown flat belief all the time. So that's kind of to give you both sides of that debate, sort of the two sides. And I think there's like also this further really interesting question of like, does scripture support doxasticism, that faith requires belief, or maybe the weaker view that faith could sometimes, you could have faith without a full-on belief. And I think there's a live debate happening here too. So Dan Howard Schneider has a paper called Markan Faith, where he argues that scripture supports the weaker view, whereas like I think William Lane Craig thinks it supports the doxastic view. So yeah, I think there's a lot. This is a really important question. A lot of the literature's been focusing on. I think there's other important questions as well, but definitely one that people are hotly divided on.
Perhaps developing on this, one of the distinctions in the philosophy of religion is oftentimes the distinction between belief in and belief that, about the belief in a proposition and someone's attitude towards it. We seem to talk about this discussion about faith as, okay, we could have faith in something that we're not 100% certain of. But on another hand, you could almost see the inverse of the question. Is it possible to believe in something but not really have faith in that? I suppose one believes that God exists, but kind of still rejects to have belief in or worship God. Would that constitute not having faith in God, or would you still say that person kind of has faith in God but doesn't worship God? How would that work?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and I think helpful because I think this is actually, there's more agreement on this question. So I think most people think you can have belief without faith. So, for example, let me just say the general thing first and then give some examples. Part of this is because faith requires you to view the object of faith positively. A desire for it to be true, thinking it would be a good thing, having some kind of positive view of it, however we spell that out. And belief just doesn't. So I believe lots of things I just am totally neutral towards, it'll be a certain temperature tomorrow. I mean, I'm not always neutral towards that, but just for example, if I don't really care and I'm just like staying inside all day or whatever, I believe, I believe things I wish were false, right? Like I believe maybe I missed my flight, but I really wish that weren't true. Or even more serious, I believe one of my friends has cancer. I believe my friend will never quit smoking and it could kill her, So just giving examples, like it would be very weird to say I have faith that my friend has cancer. I have faith that I missed my flight. And so I think these kinds of cases, most people think support this idea. You can believe things that you don't have faith in. Because faith requires this desire, this positivity that belief just doesn't. And then the question is, okay, but does every instance of faith require belief, or do they just kind of come apart? It's like, could you have faith without belief and belief without faith? So there's actually kind of I think a nuanced relationship between faith and belief, partially coming back to this thing, like we shouldn't just define faith as religious belief, because I think a lot of people think, if nothing else, faith is more than belief. There's a question of whether it's less than belief, but it's definitely more than belief. And I think almost everyone in the literature would agree with that.
That's quite fascinating. And perhaps developing upon this to the person engaging with maybe apologetics literature or natural theology, what are some considerations that goes into deciding whether or not someone should have faith in something? Is it just based on propositions, arguments, or are there further considerations, maybe someone's aesthetic reaction to God's plan or the scriptures, or I suppose a wide other variety of other beliefs? What goes into this conception of faith?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so the first thing to say is evidence matters. Like, to say evidence just doesn't matter at all is to misunderstand faith and to misunderstand, I think, the way most people are thinking about that term. So there's a balance here, right? Because I don't think it requires certainty. You don't have to be certain in the thing that you're considering whether to have faith in. We can just use God's existence as an example. You absolutely do not have to be certain that God exists to have faith. That I think, if nothing else, I hope people will get that out of this. I don't think anyone argues faith requires certainty, right? And I don't even think it requires super high confidence. I mean, it might require moderate confidence or even enough confidence to have a belief. But I really think to think that bar for evidence is too high is going to make a mistake. On the other hand, I think to put the bar too low is also going to make a mistake, especially when we're thinking about faith as an attitude, because again, we don't want to go against the evidence. Maybe we go beyond it in some sense, but not against it. And so I do think the evidence matters, and thinking about whether you have sufficient evidence is going to be relevant, again, especially focusing on faith as an attitude. So that's one thing to look at, is just the considerations for and against. the really truth-based ones. The other thing, well, maybe two more things. What do you want to be true? Do you see beauty in this story? I mean, there's the axiology, the value-based reasons, and then maybe the aesthetic reasons as well, I think will play into that. Like, does this story appeal to you? Do you think it would be a good thing if God existed? Does the Christian story, does it resonate? And I think some of that resonating is actually could be traced back to a truth-based thing. Like, this seems true. This seems to describe reality. That would be more evidence. But if it's like, this is beautiful and I want it to be true, that might be more of the second reason. And again, that's because faith requires this desire or this positive attitude. And we shouldn't have faith in something that's bad for us. An example might be having faith that your abusive ex-boyfriend, that you'll get back together with him or something, right? Like, that just seems, you might mistakenly think that would be a good thing for you, but it seems really, really bad to have faith, even if it's possible. I think it's possible because from your perspective, you in some sense see it as a good thing, but it seems irrational or really bad for you in some sense. And so I think really thinking about, is this a good thing? Is this good for me? Does this promote my flourishing? Is going to be relevant. So truth-based considerations, value and aesthetic-based considerations. And then I think also just thinking about, is this a commitment worth making, a commitment that I want to make? Does it fit with my other commitments? Faith is a commitment. And of course, different kinds of faith are going to be different levels of commitment. If you commit to meeting your friend at a coffee shop on a certain day, that's maybe less of a thick commitment than making a full-blown religious commitment. That's a much bigger commitment, or committing to marry someone, that's a much bigger commitment. But I do think thinking of faith as a commitment and thinking about, is this a commitment worth making? Is this something I want to commit to? Does it fit with my other commitments? It's going to be related to those first two things, but I do think that's kind of another element we can think about. So it's complicated, right? Having faith is going to involve evidence and truth, but it is going to involve desires. It's going to involve what kind of commitments you have and are willing to make. And I do think it's going to be more complex kind of calculation and consideration than just the question of whether to believe something. But that makes sense, right? Because faith, I think, is more complex than belief. So yeah, those are at least some of the things you might consider. I'm not saying that's exhaustive. There might be other things as well, but those are sort of some salient ones.
And perhaps narrowing down that a bit more, there's a concern, I suppose, of it potentially being this bar for evidence being either too high or too low. But is there any objective way or almost this ideal standard upon which we just say, well, okay, once it gets to maybe 50% or 60%, I'll say, well, that's a reasonable thing to have faith in? Or is it almost an intuition? Because sometimes I talk to some of my family members, I'm like, why are you a Christian? They're like, well, I look out the window and I see the world's very complex, and therefore I believe that God exists. And that seems to be a very reasonable thing to do. But then someone who might look at it from a more critical lens might say, well, okay, there's loads of responses to it. So it seems like the bar for each person is very different. And in some sense, it seems to be rather subjective. How do we engage with that subjectivity, I suppose?
No, I think that's a really good question. And I don't know that I have a satisfying answer, or like, here is the probabilistic threshold, or here's how to calculate the probabilistic threshold. Because I do think it's going to be, like you said, it is complicated, and it does seem somewhat contextual. And I completely acknowledge that. I mean, maybe the first thing to say is part of the answer to this will depend on some of the things we've just been talking about. Okay, so first of all, are we talking about faith as an attitude or faith as an action? The probabilistic bar for faith as an attitude is going to be higher. The probabilistic bar for faith as an action is going to be lower. Maybe as low as non-zero, depending on how much you have to gain, by taking the action, right? So the perhaps slightly more interesting question is, what's the bar for faith as an attitude? Then that's going to depend on, well, does that require belief or not? And so I think if it does require belief, then minimally it's going to be the threshold for belief, which people do debate about. There's some interesting arguments, and in fact, I've even argued it's at least, there's some cases that are interesting to think about where you might believe something that's less than 50%, but I think those cases are really rare, and most people are going to say probably irrational, or if they're rational, it's very few and far between, right? So middling credences around 0.5 might be okay. But when credence is just the probability you judge a proposition to be. Sorry, I should have said that. But when you start getting lower, I think it's going to get more and more controversial. And then especially if you say faith doesn't require belief, then I think you could probably, it's going to be more plausible to get maybe credences in the 0.4 or 0.3 range, right? You judge it to be 40 or 30% likely. But once you're starting to get to the 0.2, 0.1 range where it's only 20% likely or 10% likely, and it's going to, I mean, I'm not giving a threshold here. This is going to be really context dependent. But at some point, your faith is going to go against the evidence. It's not just going to go beyond it, right? And so part of this is going to depend on, again, how much is at stake, how good it would be if the object of faith were true, how much you want it to be true. But I will say, at whatever point we lose faith, whether that's closer to 0.5 or slightly lower, I do think that's where we can rely on hope. What's cool about hope is that hope just requires a non-zero probability. So as long as your probability of the thing, I can hope it's going to be sunny tomorrow, even if there's a 99% chance of rain, right? And so that's where I do think hope comes in and has a role to play here, where things get really, really improbable. You might not be able to have faith. Your faith might go against the evidence. But in this sense, hope can go against the evidence. And I know that sounds bad, but it's because it's just totally different than belief. You're not believing against the evidence. You're having an attitude that acknowledges there's some possibility of this thing, even if it's a really low chance against the evidence. And that's totally rational. So yeah, I will say whatever that threshold is, where faith goes against the evidence and becomes irrational, I think hope can come in and sort of help you continue in that commitment, even in light of really, really serious doubts. So giving up your faith doesn't mean giving up everything. It doesn't mean giving up the commitment altogether.
That's quite fascinating, and you do talk upon, and I'd like to elaborate on this a bit more about how the different credence that someone has to a proposition may impact how much they have faith in it. And in some sense, faith almost, in an ideal sense, faith should be something which I guess someone could say is independent, not independent, but rather you could have way stronger faith even if the credence you give to a proposition decreases a bit. But at the same time, other times you can have faith which itself seems to be affected in relation to the credence, but it's not necessarily related to on a one-to-one scale. Perhaps the credence has to drop significantly before a small kind of a bit of faith drops, but it's still there in some sense. And likewise, if someone's belief in something increases, it might not necessarily dictate faith increasing significantly, or it could in an exponentially large sense. I was wondering what's the relationship between the credence one gives a proposition and how much faith they have in it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of putting it. And I like a lot of what you just said. And I do think because faith is this more complex attitude than just belief or just credence, right? That's belief and credence are both, they just seem to be like pretty evidence-based attitudes where they kind of decrease or increase in accord with your evidence, especially credence, right? And so I think faith is different because it does have this desire and commitment element. And so I do think like that, your way of describing it is one way to think about it. Like it's not going to be sensitive to every single little evidential change because it is this kind of firm and steadfast commitment that's based on evidence, but also based on desires, commitments, and these maybe aesthetic reasons, value-based reasons, that kind of thing. And so because it's not just a purely, you could say, epistemic attitude or evidence-based attitude, I think it can kind of be steadfast in light of some degree of evidential changes in a way that at least definitely credences shouldn't be. Like if your credences or your confidence in a proposition sort of modeled as a probability, right? And so if I'm modeling, let's say, the probability I'm giving to whether it will rain tomorrow, that should just fluctuate basically immediately with the forecast, right? If it goes up to 80%, then it should be 0.8. If it goes down to 50%, it should be 0.5. Like it would just be weird to be like, oh, the forecast predicts a 90% chance of rain, but I'm going to go ahead and put my credence at 0.5. I mean, of course, if you were like, the forecast is inaccurate and that's your reasoning, that's one thing, but like you should proportion it to what your evidence supports. And it should follow your evidence it should track your evidence pretty much exactly. And I think faith is just going to be different because it's not a credence-like attitude. It's more of a steadfast, flat-out commitment-like attitude. And so I think you're right. Degree of faith isn't just going to be based on degree of evidence. It's going to be based on strength of desire and also just kind of like that commitment element. So yeah, so I think that's a nice way of putting it. It's not to say there's no correlation. Maybe if your credence drastically drops, at some point, again, you're going to have to give up the faith. Maybe you move to hope or something, right? And so it's not to say there's no correlation, but there's just a steadfastness element to faith that doesn't occur for attitudes like credence.
I suppose moving on from that, we've talked a lot about faith in relationship to the theist, but perhaps we could flip it and talk about the atheist. And this ties into, I suppose, a credence you give a proposition. What role does faith play in the composition or the development of someone's worldview? Because I could think of an example, maybe an atheist does not believe in the logical problem of evil. I think there's a non-zero chance of God existing, maybe 5 or 10% that God exists. But they say, I don't have faith in God. Should we classify the person as would it be right to classify the person as an atheist, agnostic? How should we classify their faith in relationship to their credence? And I suppose, is the terms of theist, agnostic, or atheist even the right words to correspond to someone's faith situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's good. So yeah, a lot of people think roughly there's 3 belief-like attitudes you can take towards God's existence. Just to give the audience background, you can believe God exists, you're a theist, you can withhold belief, you're an agnostic, and you can disbelieve, you're an atheist, right? And so then how these 3 attitudes interact with faith, and also how these 3 attitudes interact with one's credence. I mean, there's a whole host of questions there we could talk about. One way to put this whole does faith require belief question is, do you have to be a theist to have faith that God exists, or could an agnostic have faith that God exists, right? So that's kind of to fit that threefold categorization into what we've already been talking about. That's kind of the question a lot of people are wrestling with. Another big question, though, is, I mean, this is sort of the positive side of your question. Could an atheist ever have faith? And what I've argued is actually that an atheist could have faith. I know you stipulated in your case they decide not to, but I think they could have faith in the action sense. So an atheist could act on the question of whether God exists. They could act as if God exists. They might want God to exist, and on the basis of that desire, I think an atheist could have action-focused faith. But I've argued they're probably not going to have enough evidence to have attitude-focused faith. So then another question, this is maybe more related to your question, is what about an atheist who thinks there's some chance that God exists? So it's not like they're giving it a probability 0, but they decide not to have faith in God. Like, what's going on there? Well, I do think a lot of atheists, this is probably their situation. I think most atheists probably do not have faith that God exists. I partially just mentioned that just because I don't want to say, let's say you feel like you're an atheist and you're stuck there. I don't think all hope is lost. I think there's things you can do to move towards having faith or having theistic faith if that's something you wanted. But yeah, if an atheist doesn't have faith, I mean, one thing is they might just not view God's existence positively. They may not want God to exist, right? So that could be partially why they don't have faith. And I do think, like I said, they don't have enough evidence probably to have action-focused faith, and so that could be another element as well. But to have attitude faith, they have to view God's existence positively, and if they just don't, then I think they wouldn't have action-focused faith. So I don't know, does that answer your question? I feel like maybe there's an element of it that I'm missing, but hopefully that was at least somewhat helpful.
Yeah, I think it does answer that question. And I suppose I want to maybe develop a bit upon the idea of atheists having faith in some sense, an atheist acting as if God exists. And sometimes you think about, I guess, Jordan Peterson as a common example. He always says, oh, does God exist or not? He always says, well, that's a very complex question. I shall act as if God exists. How would we imagine or think of an atheist who acts as if God exists? And in fact, I suppose in even further question developing on this beyond our discussion about faith is, what exactly should we expect for someone to be doing if they were to act as if God exists?
Good. Yeah. No, this is great. I will point, what's the name of it? Faith and Disbelief by Robert Whitaker. I will point people to that article because I think it's a really nice article. He thinks atheists can just have faith in every sense. And I think that's too strong. I don't think they can have attitude faith, but I do think, like I said, they can have action faith. And I think a lot of his arguments are really interesting examples of that. So he has this example of a character, and I'm blanking on what he named the character, but she has gone to church her whole life, and for a while she's like, yep, I believe Christianity. I think in the story she is a Christian, but kind of slowly gets to the point where her doubts just eat away at her, and she's agnostic for a while, and eventually comes to the place where she actually doesn't believe that God exists. But so she's an atheist. She thinks there is no God, but she thinks the Christian story is really beautiful. She thinks God becoming a man, dying in our place, showing us how to live is like a really cool story. She wants it to be true. She wishes it were true. And she actually never leaves the church. She continues to go to church. She actually volunteers to like watch the kids in the nursery. She gives money to charity. And she really does structure her life around the Christian story despite being an atheist, because she thinks it's so beautiful, and she thinks it would be such a good thing that if it were true, it's worth sort of taking that risk and, you know, giving up sleeping in on Sunday mornings, giving up the amount of money that she's tithing or giving to the church, because her desire for it to be true is that strong. She thinks the risk is worth it. And so, you know, Robert Whitaker, the guy who wrote the article, he does a really good job kind of expanding on that story and giving you even more details to, I think, make it convincing. But what I think is really helpful about this is that I think some people might feel like their atheism is forced on them. They feel stuck in their atheism and they wish they weren't atheists. So there's really two desires. One is like wishing you would believe in God, and the other is just like wishing that God did exist, you know? And they might have both of those desires. They might wish they believed in God and wish God existed, but they like feel like the evidence is trapping them in atheism. And part of me wants to say, like, not all hope is lost if you're in that situation, and there are things you can do, both, I think, to demonstrate action-focused faith. Like, think back to Thomas, who didn't trust the police, but jumps anyway. I think you can kind of take that leap of faith despite Thomas disbelieving the police are trustworthy. You might disbelieve God exists, but you can still sort of take that leap and demonstrate a version of faith. Is it full-blown faith? No. But like, here's what I say. I have a paper that's called Can Atheists Have Faith? And I give this comparison, and I think it's helpful. There's the person that James is writing to in the epistle that has the attitude and doesn't act on it, is not willing to make sacrifices for Christianity. Maybe they go to church, maybe not, but they're really just going through the motions, and they don't want to have any significant parts of their life to be sacrificed for this religion. Okay. Then take the person that is an atheist. So, but maybe they feel their atheism is forced on them. They wish they weren't an atheist, and they're willing to make wild sacrifices on the truth of Christianity. And so to say, well, the first person, because they have a belief, they're a true Christian. But the second person, because they don't have a belief, they're not a true Christian. Like, maybe there's an element that is non-ideal in both situations and they're both missing. But I would say that the person who's an atheist but willing to make these radical sacrifices for Christianity is, in a way, like, it's like that the person in Mark, the dad who says, like, I believe but help my unbelief. I mean, the atheist might not say I believe, but they have unbelief that they're struggling with, but they're still willing to take huge risks on the basis of Christianity. And so the thought is to make it all about belief, I think, just seems wrong to me. I don't think that's the heart of the Christian story and the heart of what God is asking from us. Even if you think that is part of it, I think the person who believes and doesn't act, it's not at all obvious to me they're better off than the person who acts but can't bring themselves quite to believe. And the last thing I'll just say too is I think the atheist who does make this religious commitment of a certain type puts themselves on the path to eventually coming to believe. And I think that's also powerful as well. It's some of our beliefs we can't just directly choose, but we can put ourselves on the path to sort of change those beliefs. And so they might get to the point where they have both the attitude faith and the action faith.
That's quite fascinating. And one of the questions that does come to mind is, what does one's model of epistemology tie in with how one conceives of faith? Because it would seem to me, if someone followed Kant, I suppose, and said, well, there is no things in themselves. All we're doing is trying to perceive the world with some categories that we already have in our minds. Faith to that person might be quite different to someone like maybe a Nietzsche who says, well, all right, all things are just perspectives. So, well, what is faith on that model? Like, how should we conceive of faith in light of these different epistemological models? Should these epistemological models have an impact on one's conception of faith? How do these ideas tie in with each other?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think there's probably some ground that could be explored further here, just to like look at how faith might interact. Because I do think, like, probably, especially if you're familiar with epistemology, like listening to this conversation, you can probably tell I'm coming at it from kind of a sort of traditional, not fully evidentialist perspective, but definitely a perspective of like, conceiving of epistemology as like centering around evidence. And, there's debates about, is it only evidence? Is there more than evidence? Like, I'm not necessarily trying to take a stance on that, but that is sort of the paradigm I'm working within, and maybe even a lot of the people in the literature are working within. And so I think it is interesting to kind of expand our model of faith. And like, one thing is like, one contrast with this evidence-based view of things is like this more externalist-based view of things. And arguably like Plantinga, for example, thinks faith is more of a matter of some external factors being true in our mind rather than something about the evidence that we have. And so I do think there's been some work on like more externalist sort of models of faith that is really interesting. But yeah, I do think some of these epistemological paradigms, you could bring them fruitfully, I think, into discussion with faith. And I like Kant does say something really interesting is like, what is it? I have found it necessary to get rid of knowledge in order to make room for faith or something, which is really interesting because that kind of sounds like you couldn't have faith that something's true and know that it's true. So that's a really big question we didn't actually really dive into too much, is what's the relationship between faith and knowledge? And some people like Plantinga, I think faith is a kind of knowledge. And then there's a view where like faith isn't a kind of knowledge, but you could have faith and know something. And then like Kant suggests a view where like faith precludes knowledge. So anyway, that's like a whole nother question, is like, how does faith fit in with knowledge? What's that relationship? That's a really interesting. We're talking about more faith and belief, but like faith and knowledge, there's a whole nother can of worms you could look at. So.
Yeah, so I shall resist the temptation to necessarily dive into this kind of worms in concepts.
Very tempting, though.
Yes, it is very tempting. But in light of the discussion about Kant, and Kant always is very critical of arguments for the existence of God, I suppose, as we're slowly moving towards our discussion on Pascal's wager, do you think Christians need to present a robust argument for their belief or perhaps more specifically for their faith? What does the role of argumentation play a role there?
Yeah, so I mean, this is like the nitpicky philosophy answer, but it does depend on what the need is modifying, right? So I do accept what's known as reformed epistemology. Reformed epistemology is the view that one can rationally believe in God without an argument. And I think that this is just true. I think that there's many people that haven't studied philosophy, haven't looked at arguments for and against God's existence. They have no idea what the Kalam cosmological argument is. I mean, you could think about, I think it's maybe Plantinga. Somebody talked about this example of your sweet grandma who goes to church every week, prays for you every night before she goes to bed. Like she hasn't studied like any kind of intense theology and philosophy, but to say you're going to really say she's like unjustified in her religious belief, that seems way too strong. Children, I think, can have justified beliefs that God exists. I don't think they have to be aware of intense arguments, right? So I do accept reformed epistemology. And I do think one really important thing to note here is that arguments and evidence aren't the same thing. So you could have evidence for your belief in God without being able to cite off a 6-premise argument based on the impossibility of an actual infinite series and blah, 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 right? You know what I mean? And so this isn't to say that these people don't have evidence that God exists. They might have really interesting, robust, and important evidence, but maybe it's testimonial evidence or evidence from experience or something like that. So yeah, I think on the other hand, though, you don't want to diminish the importance of arguments too much. So you can say they're not required for rational belief without saying they are stupid and unhelpful, right? I think they are helpful, right? I think there is really interesting evidence for theism out there that people aren't always aware of, or sometimes they're getting like a little bit of it, but like not the, like maybe not the most robust, interesting arguments, which is kind of a bummer. And that's actually one reason I love like channels like yours. And I try to like do YouTube interviews, and I encourage like other academics to as well. It's like a really good way to help get arguments out there that people who aren't going to go like read a philosophy journal, but maybe they'll watch a YouTube video, you know what I mean? And so I think it's actually really important to try to get philosophy out to the masses, especially philosophy of religion, in the various ways that we can, because I think it's actually really helpful for Christians and for non-Christians. So yeah, I think there's really interesting evidence for theism out there, and arguments can help Christians like overcome doubts. They can help them answer the doubts and questions of other people. And so I think, yeah, we should definitely study the arguments for God's existence. I think we should be wary of saying, like, as Christians, let's say, like, we shouldn't just say they're all great and successful and obviously sound. Like that's also, I think, not genuine. I think being honest and saying, yeah, like this is, maybe we like this argument and we think this argument's more questionable. Like I've actually never been a super big fan of the traditional collab, not to keep bringing it back to that. But for example, I'm like not convinced about a lot of the premises about infinities that those rely on. So yeah, I think like bringing these arguments to play, talking about how they're interesting and important, but not being so dogmatic that we say any argument with a conclusion I agree with is a good argument. We should also resist that as well.
That's quite fascinating. And I suppose tying into arguments for the existence of God, one could think about Pascal's wager. And perhaps there's two prongs of this question. Firstly, what is Pascal's wager? And number two, how does Pascal's wager fit into the question of faith? And the reason why I asked what is Pascal's wager is a lot of people approach from a very intuitive perspective to say, well, all right, Pascal's wager, we have God. If God exists and I believe in him, all good. If God doesn't exist and, I believe in him, no problemo, and therefore I should believe in God. Is that a fair representation of Pascal's wager, or do you think that's a result of oversimplified popular philosophy?
Yeah. I mean, I will say I do often give the simple version first, but then kind of with the caveat, like it's really going to have to be more complex than this. And even Pascal himself arguably made it more complex than this. So yeah, I think, and then it becomes a harder question to answer because then there's just a bunch of different versions of Pascal's wager. But I guess I'll say maybe the thing that I think unites these versions of Pascal's wager is it's giving a practical or pragmatic argument that you should wager on, believe in, commit to God because of something like some kind of cost benefit analysis. Okay, so you're right. Like the most simple version is like you wager on God, you go to heaven, that's infinitely good. Then considering, you wager on God and God doesn't exist, or considering you don't wager on God and God exists, or you don't wager on God and God doesn't exist, like all of those possibilities seem less than infinitely good. And so like wagering on God and God existing is just going to trump all of those. So given that really simple cost benefit analysis, you should wager on God. But then I think like there's a lot of questions that are raised. So like, what about various religions? What do we say about that? I will say in the Pensée, when you look at what comes right before the wager, Pascal actually argues if one religion is true, it's Christianity, mostly on the basis of stuff like fulfilled prophecy. And so then he thinks we're really in this standstill between Christianity and atheism. And if you're in that kind of standstill, the wager makes perfect sense because you really just have one religion as the live option. There are other ways of going as well, though. You can try to incorporate the different religions into this cost-benefit analysis. And there you'll look at things like what's the probability these religions are true. I would say that's the most important and most salient consideration. But you could also consider other things like how hard is it going to be to convert to these religions? What's the probability I successfully convert? What kind of costs and benefits are these religions allowing? How good would it be? Like, how much do I want this religion to be true? Like all of those things are going to be kind of considerations as well. But I usually think the most important thing is going to be the probability of that the religion is true. And so what I will often say is, as like a little bit of a slogan that's like maybe admittedly slightly oversimplistic, you should wager on the religion that you think is most likely to be true. And that's kind of how I solve this worry about many gods or various religions. But then there's a ton of other questions as well. And we don't have to get into all of them, but like one is like, what is wagering? Is it just believing in God? This whole conversation we've talked about faith and how maybe faith is maybe more robust in some ways than belief, or closer to what a true religious commitment is. I mean, I would probably say that. So maybe it's more about something like faith. Maybe it's more about something like action focused instead. You know what I mean? And so then like, what is wagering? That's maybe another big thing we could talk about. And then another thing that's related to this is like, when is it rational to use a cost benefit analysis like this? Is this a really good way to go? Is this a good basis for a religious commitment or not? I mean, both in terms of rationality, but I think I also get this objection from Christians, which is like, this maybe is coming then to maybe the heart of your question is like, could someone's faith be based on some kind of cost benefit analysis like this? And I guess like a couple things to say in response to that. I mean, the first is like, I think you have to think about a cost benefit analysis as like really broad. It's not just like the thing you do when you're like gambling at a casino table or, doing some kind of cold-hearted calculation. It's like the basis of basically every decision we make every day ever, including really important personal decisions, including whether we should marry someone. We're just we're weighing like pros and cons, and often doing this in the face of uncertainty. Even if you know the person you're going to marry really well, there is some level of uncertainty. You don't know every single thought they've ever had or every single fact about their previous life, and you are going to have to kind of like weigh up your evidence, weigh up your desires, and like decide like, is this the best course of action? I don't think that undermines your sincerity as someone deciding to marry this person, or is this your sincerity as a spouse? Like, it is just something you should do. You shouldn't go marry someone on a whim, like maybe people do in like some of those TV shows, you know what I mean? And so I think like, look, like if you're doing something similar in your religious commitment, like that's not irrational, and that's not unfaithful. And in fact, it's just like being a thoughtful person that takes their decisions seriously. And you're not just like converting to religions on a whim just because you feel like it. You're actually like thinking through whether or not you should do it. And then to say like, what might this actually look like? Well, I think it's like something like this, like, look, I have some uncertainty about whether God exists or whether this religion is true. But despite that uncertainty, I think this is a risk worth taking. I mean, this is kind of like the atheist that demonstrates faith. The person doesn't have to be an atheist, but Pascal's wager does sort of presuppose there's a level of uncertainty going on here. And so the idea is that like, you say, look, I'm uncertain about whether God exists, but I think like maybe the Christian story, for example, is really, really, really beautiful. Or like, it would be so cool if there was a God who created everything and who cared about me and was personal and like had a plan and purpose for the universe, right? And so if I do commit to that God, there's a lot I have to gain. That could be a really good thing. And so that's a risk worth taking because of the beauty of the world's being that way, the beauty of my having, you know, a closer connection to or relationship with that being, the beauty of being with other people who also have that connection, being, you know, in relationship with their community with those people. And so because I have all those things to gain, this seems like a risk worth taking and a commitment worth making despite my uncertainty. And so it doesn't just have to be like this cold calculation based on like rewards you'll get in heaven. I mean, I think even the concept of reward, it's just like a weird word, but if it's just like something that you want or desire, like maybe rewards even aren't so bad, but the reward can be God's self. Like the reward doesn't have to be like, I want to be rich or something, you know what I mean? So anyway, I think a lot of times we're just thinking about these concepts too narrowly. And when we think about them more broadly, I don't think Pascal's wager is at all odds with demonstrating faith. And I actually have a paper that's called Faithfully Taking Pascal's Wager, where I argue this in more detail. If you're not convinced, you could check that paper out. So, yeah.
Fascinating. Well, perhaps to end off this video, and there's so many small rabbit holes that I would love to delve into, but I mean, in light of time, I think it would be good to slowly wrap up this video. How should we approach the philosophy of religion in especially with regards to apologetics outreach in light of our understanding of faith in Pascal's wager? Because we've talked already a bit about, well, our arguments do mean something. We probably should look at these arguments. Well, we've also looked at the role of faith and how sometimes that can go beyond the evidence. How should we approach the philosophy of religion in light of this framework?
Yeah, good. I mean, first of all, just to emphasize, like, I agree, arguments are great. Keep looking at the arguments, but I'll give a couple of things that you can do in addition to that. So maybe like add on to continue with the arguments, keep looking at those, keep exploring those. The first thing is, I think, when thinking about our own faith and talking to others about potential faith, there's really two elements that I think are relevant. There's truth, which is that's the argument a bit. And then there's like desire and goodness, which is how much should you want the Christian story to be true? How good is the Christian story? How beautiful is it? And I think when we're talking to people about it, we shouldn't just give arguments. We should also talk about the beauty of the Christian story. And if nothing else, give a little light up a little bit of a desire for the Christian story to be true. I think that's really important. Faith, like I said, involves desire. I think a lot of people, even if they're not convinced by the arguments, can be really motivated by desire. And I think commitments also involve desire. Like, it would be really weird to be in a marriage where you had like no desire for the other person, or you didn't see any goodness in them, or you didn't want to get to know them better, right? And so in the same way, faith involves desire, not just this evidential piece. And so I do think emphasizing that desire component in your conversations with people and the beauty of the Christian story, even apart from its truth, I think is important. So think about truth and goodness together is like one potential thing. And then I think another related thing is you don't always have to feel like you have to have people believing Christianity to be your goal. I mean, I think that's a great goal and that can be one of the goals. But I think you could also say if like they're just not there yet, like encourage them to try it on, encourage them to read a book with evidence, encourage them to go to church a couple times or talk to some more religious people. I think a commitment to like something weaker can be sometimes a little more feasible or really realistic for people than just like jumping in with 2 feet to belief, right? And I think again, like we talked about, put them on the path to believing over time, even if they're not like just totally convinced by all your arguments on the spot. So those are 2 things. And the last thing I really think is super important, so I want to emphasize and drill down on, is like we gotta stop obsessing over certainty. I think people view certainty as an ideal for belief and for faith, both for themselves and also for like other people they're trying to talk to. So like you might worry if you ever have uncertainty about your own faith that you're somehow like being a bad Christian or sinning. And then you might also like, I've seen this in youth groups, for example, if someone comes to you with like questions or concerns or doubts, you might like try to stifle that and say like, no, we really like shouldn't be doing that. I think that is so dangerous. And I think that like really certainty should not, is in no sense an ideal. First of all, we can be certain of very little. There's so few things we can actually truly be certain of. This is like what Descartes talks about. Descartes thinks even like you could be deceived about math and logic by some evil demon or mad scientist. And he thinks that the only thing you can be certain of is, I think, therefore I am. But even that, it's like, well, what if the Buddhists are right and there is no self? Like Hume thinks there's like the cogito is questionable. So it's like really, even if you think you can be certain of a couple things, it's just a small handful of things. Most things you cannot be truly 100% certain of, okay? So that's the first thing to say is just like certainty is just a really high bar. The second thing to say is having questions and doubts is totally normal. These are hard issues. There's reasons philosophers have been debating these for centuries. And so instead of stifling questions and doubts, let's normalize questions and doubts. And let's say, yeah, like it's completely reasonable to have a Christian commitment and have questions and doubts. Lots of people in the Bible had questions and doubts, sometimes all the time. God didn't tell them like, stop asking questions, don't think about it. Like Thomas had tons of doubts and questions, and what did Jesus do? Gave Thomas evidence, said, literally touch my hand and see the scars. Jesus didn't say just like, don't worry about it, or like you should just be certain, And so I think working together with people, like if you don't have the answer, then like trying to find that together, like trying to find the truth together is a much better attitude to have than just trying to stifle doubts and questions. And in my class, I am like, so important to me to say like that's a really good point. I want to like think more about that if a student raises a good question, rather than just trying to crush their curiosity or their inquisitive nature. And I think that when we see that a Christian commitment doesn't require certainty, we have a lot more freedom to kind of explore Christianity and realize that, like we talked about, faith can be steadfast even in light of our fluctuating confidence. So the bottom line of all of this, our commitment is much more important than our certainty. And I've said that before, and I think I'll say that again, because how important something is to you, how central it is to your life, how much you want it to be true, those are all things that I think are much more important than like whether something is technically certain or not. So like math, it might be very close to certain, but it's not like this huge, like 1 + 1 = 2. That's not like this hugely important thing to me that I structure my life around in the way that like my marriage or my religious commitment are. And so again, focusing more on what am I committed to, what are the reasons I'm committed to that, rather than like, am I just fully certain of this and never have any doubts about it, I think is a much better focus, both thinking about ourselves and thinking about other people and their questions.
That's such an important emphasis, and I think it's a brilliant way to wrap up and end off this YouTube video. You've talked a bit about some of the projects you do and some of your public philosophy. Can you tell us a bit more about where people can find you? And I suppose if someone wants to research more about this question of faith and Pascal's wager, what resources can they turn to?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a website. So the website is liz-jackson.com. And I do have, if you're kind of like up for reading journal articles and maybe a little more academic stuff, you can go on my research page, and basically every article I have is linked on there, and it'll take you to like the Phil Papers site, which is just a common website that archives philosophy papers. And if you click on the title on that site, you can access all of my articles on there. If you're more not so much into the journal article stuff, on that same website, I have a tab called Public Philosophy. And on that tab, I actually have a YouTube channel that I'm not necessarily posting on like every single week, but I do have videos. I'm going to do a couple soon, actually, new videos on there. So I am posting, occasionally, usually like once a month or something. And so there's a bunch of videos on there on faith, epistemology, Pascal's wager, bunch of topics, so you can check that out. That's linked, like I said, under Public Philosophy. And I also have like a playlist of all the other times I've been on YouTube on other people's channels that you can check out. And that's going to be all on my YouTube channel. And then also just on that Public Philosophy page, I have links to like blog posts and, other podcasts and just other, kind of related, more popular level things that I've done. So I would highlight my website with those two pages, and then the YouTube channel as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for sharing those resources. I'll try to link those in the description below. So if you want to go check out any more resources on faith and Pascal's wager, make sure you go check it out there. Thank you so much for coming on this channel. I really hope you enjoyed this video. And as always, if you want to hear more about different aspects of philosophy, let me know in the comments section, and I'll try my best to make those videos for you. Stay safe. See you soon. Thank you for watching, and God bless. I'll see you in the next one.